This particular presentation is meant to follow Dwayne's, where he's kind of given a really good overview, and then we delve into a lot of details. I'd love a quick show of hands of who was in the room a few minutes ago when Dwayne was presenting. Great. That's going to be really helpful to me. If you just arrived, there's going to be a few times that it might feel like we're just diving in really quickly and you don't have a lot of backdrop, and I apologize for that. Happy to fill in any details afterwards if you have any questions. What we want to do this morning is really move straight from what Dwayne shared into some really practical tips about what this looks like. And we're going to be covering a couple of different areas. You've got a handout in front of you that covers the 5 key points that I want to share with you this morning. And before we go there, this quote that I have up on the screen by Larry Bossidy, nothing that we do is more important than hiring and developing people. And at the end of the day, you bet on people, not strategies. Many of you in this room are familiar with EOS operating systems, and when they do surveys of companies coming to them for facilitator help on their businesses, they discovered that 82.4% of every company that came to them was struggling with people issues, and that was their number one frustration. And I have a feeling that that's probably would be reflected in this room as well. So it wasn't sales, it wasn't profit, it was people. But uniquely enough, EOS would teach you, and I would certainly agree, that people are actually your one competitive advantage. So how can it be that the one thing that can set us up for the most success is also the thing that we're saying is our key frustration? We're going to delve into some of that today and walk through this. Why I stand here today is that in the past 2 years, I have been in a seat of doing quite a lot of hiring, and I've had over 1,200 resumes come across my desk, and on average interviewed 3 to 5 people a week. You do that for a little while and you learn a few things, and I'd love to share some of that with you today. Really, I care deeply about people, and if I can share through the struggles that I've had and the journey that has led us here today, things that are going to help you as a business owner, as a startup, if you're in a position of growth or a period of change, I want to do that. I was incredibly grateful for all the people that I was able to learn from. Down here on the table, you'll see a few books that I've set up. These are books that were incredible resources, and you'll see reflections from these books in my talk today. Well, there we go. So this goes right with what you have in front of you. There's a lot to cover. My very favorite topic is the last one. We'll see how much time we can spend on that. And I have a feeling a good part of our time is going to be spent on the initial portions. When you go to hiring, as Dwayne said in his workshop, there is a lot of questions that you want to ask yourself and make sure that you understand how to hire for this position so that ultimately the individual will be successful. And if the individual in that seat is successful, you by default are going to be successful as well. We tend to get this backwards, and we want the business to be successful, and sometimes we don't take into consideration the individual. You need to know what this individual's skill set is. What are they good at? Not only can they carry out the task because they have the physical capabilities, but what are their natural proclivities? What is who they are? Does it fit in this role? Are they going to feel comfortable and excel, or is there going to always be this stretch or this area that is a rub for them? And one of the things that can be really helpful with this is assessments, people assessments, personality assessments. That could be predictive index. It might be DISC. It could be caliber or strength finder. Whatever that you're using, use it throughout your entire company. And if you aren't using something, start using it. It'll give you a lot of insights. Getting the right person in the right seat is incredibly important. And one of the ways that we are going to go through this is talking about interviewing and how do you know if someone is a good fit. Before we go there, I want to talk just a little bit more about job descriptions. Here is a job description for a sales position, and it really is that one-sheeter that's going to take the work that you've done with your team hopefully at least 3 key individuals, and you've agreed what this position looks like. What is the purpose for it? What is the mission for it? And what are the competencies? Dwayne had put a few competencies up on the board. You'll see some of those reflected here. In this particular position, there are 13 competencies listed. And these are not going to be in the same way for every position throughout your company. It's not necessarily your core values as a company. It has more to do with this specific seat and what's needed to succeed in that seat. And then the cultural fit, along with some skills up above it. I missed the technical requirements. A lot of times we focus on the technical requirements and we don't spend as much time thinking about that cultural fit that we need in our company. When you start to look at bringing an individual into this team, it's incredibly important to remember the dynamic that's going to have. One of our tenured team members said to me in a passing conversation, you know, we have the most unique blend of people and backgrounds that I've ever been in a company with, and I would never hang out with any of these individuals voluntarily. At first, when she said that we had a really varied group, I was kind of proud of that. And then as she continued talking, I got kind of angry because I had hired these people and I thought they were doing a good job. And she was basically telling me that she wouldn't sign up willingly to hang out with any of the people on the team. And I took that away, and as my more reasonable brain began to consider that, I realized something. And I think I'm not alone in this. As entrepreneurs, as business owners, we have a very different lens that we see things in. When I show up at work, I'm not looking for friends. I'm not looking for camaraderie. I'm not looking for shared interests. I show up for an entirely different set of reasons. I show up because I care about this company, because I have visions for it. Your employees don't have the same drive. They don't have the same vision to keep them going. And it's incredibly important as a leader to step back and sit in their shoes and imagine what it looks like to work side by side with your team members. And that is very, very meaningful, that sense of team spirit, that sense of continuity. And it was really at that season that we began to realize we had more going on in our company than we realized, and we needed to create a much stronger team culture. I'd like to share a story that happened very, very soon after this conversation. We were actually in the process of working to bring on a new team member, and I had done the interviews, and the resume for this individual was extraordinary. They had interviewed really well. I wasn't at the process that I was using the entire chronological interview process that I'll explain in a few moments. But things had gone well, and I thought we had a great candidate. They joined the office and did not mesh well with the team. It didn't take very long to see that this wasn't going to work as well as I thought it was going to work. And then I started to see that the skill sets that were all claimed on this resume, they really weren't translating. The training seemed to not resonate. There seemed to be big gaps in this person's knowledge. And it was the second day the individual showed up late. By the third day, I was having really serious questions about whether it was going to work or not. Halfway through the morning, well, towards the end of the morning, I called the individual in and I said, hey, I really noticed that you're not gelling really well with the team. I noticed that training's been really challenging. It doesn't really seem like the things that we're teaching, that you've been familiar with them. You know, talk to me a little bit about it. Tell me why you think you're a good fit for our company, because I'm starting to wonder. And I really expected in that moment that she would step up to the plate and say, well, this is different, you know, X is different than Y, but I really want to be here, and you know, this is, you know, it's going to change in the next 2 days. This has just been a hard on-ramp. And instead, she said to me, well, that's your opinion, and apparently you make the decisions. Once I had recovered my shock, I said, tell you what, why didn't you take lunch? And let's talk about it when you come back from lunch. And I got a text 20 minutes later that said, I won't be back. And I walked into Dwayne and I told him exactly what had happened. And I was really glad She had saved me a whole lot of pain and agony. If we had just pushed through the discomfort of those 3 days and said, it's gonna get better, it just needs time, that impact on the team would have been much more significant. If we had gone 9 months and then had to let that individual go, they 100% would have filed unemployment. There's so many things that happen, and just you have to be able to take that temperature and to provide that opportunity for the discussion to happen and really find out who the individual is. So sometimes what you see on a resume doesn't translate. At the end of the day, we hire people, not resumes. And every single time I've looked at a great resume, I don't actually get to hire that resume, I hire the person. And they're not always quite what you think they're going to be. And just remember that those first few days, those first few weeks, they're the best that you're gonna get. That's the honeymoon period. Makes me think of a sales rep that we brought on board one day. On the second day of training, he showed up 2 hours late, didn't respond to any texts, didn't give us any notice, didn't have any excuse when he showed up 2 hours late. And I had very good reason to believe that he was hungover, and we left him go that day. That wasn't gonna get better. If you can't come to your second day of training on time, and there isn't a known reason for what happened, don't expect that next week it's gonna be better when this person's showing up on a sales lot and nobody's around. So sometimes you need to call it, and you need to call it quickly. But I want to talk just a little bit too about the way that individuals impact each other. We had a great team member, his name was Michael. I'll be changing some names throughout this talk to protect the innocent and the guilty, but I'll also use some names where it's appropriate because I do want to acknowledge people that have done really well. And so Michael brought a lot of sort of charisma to the company. He was very encouraging. He inspired other people, and one of the things that he was really good at would be just to walk through the office and check in on people. Sometimes it would be as simple as, "You good, Nick?" And Nick would have a better day. He had a bounce in his step, he had a smile on his face, and sometimes you don't realize how greatly that impacts the company. The negative is just the same. Somebody might not be saying a lot of really negative things, but just this insidious cloud, and you often don't realize how much it's impacting until they're gone. So let's talk a little bit more about resumes. If you have started a small company like us, you probably ended up hiring somebody in your family, maybe a friend, somebody near you. You knew them, you didn't do a resume. You never saw a resume, you just started working with them. And you start to find yourself in a position where you're looking at resumes and you're needing to make decisions. Be aware that there are people who make a full-time job out of writing resumes. And they will sit with individuals who don't have much of a job history. And they will help them to write a resume that looks amazing. And I'd like to illustrate this with one of my favorite lines. And that is, how would you write on a resume that you had successfully changed a light bulb? Well, let me show you. I single-handedly managed the successful upgrade and deployment of a new environmental illumination system with 0 cost overruns and 0 safety incidents. Now, doesn't that sound amazing? Immediately, you're thinking about maybe a surgeon's room and some amazing, huge project that took a lot of time and energy. But this individual did that on their own, and they met the budget, and nobody was injured doing it. When you realize it was changing a singular light bulb, it certainly looks less impressive. So that is no joke. You will see things on resumes like that. And how do you know that? You uncover that through the interview process. So let's talk about interviewing and getting the right people on the bus and in the right seats. When you marry behavioral questions and chronological interviewing, it gets much harder and more interesting. And you ultimately get a lot more information. My questions are the same for every job. What were you hired to do? What was your team like? What were you proud of? What mistakes did you make? Who was your manager? And what were their strengths and weaknesses? And what would John Smith say your strengths and weaknesses were. What was your overall performance, and what was the reason that had you moving to the next job? Now, when I started interviewing, I cobbled together a bunch of questions that I had pulled off the internet, and I hoped that I would get enough good questions to kind of figure out who someone was. And you know, you ended up just sort of hiring on gut. I don't know if any of you have ever done that before, but you walk in and you interview someone and you feel pretty confident that you probably didn't find out what you needed to know, but you hire on gut. And inadvertently, I find when I do that I end up with a stomachache. So I knew that I needed something better, and I first found behavioral questions. And behavioral questions are really good. A lot of times they're known as STAR. So situation or task, action, and result. Basically, you're going to a person and saying, hey, tell me about a time when, and you have a situation or a task, what did you do and what was the result? So that might look like, tell me about a time that you had to make a decision without all of the information. What happened? What did you do? What was the result? The problem with situational questions, situational task questions, is that if you're talking to someone with a job history of 10 to 15 years, that person can think back through their entire job history. They can cherry pick the best story, share it with you without any context at all, and it isn't an accurate reflection of who they are. Maybe that is who they were 15 years ago, and since then they've become really jaded, and they're not going to show up that way today. You have no context. Maybe if you knew the context, you'd actually think that story was a negative, but how will you know? The reason that I ended up finding the chronological process is because I was so disillusioned with my success rate and how many hires weren't actually good hires. And I think that we like to believe we're good readers of people. We like to believe that we can make a good judgment call on a person's character. And the truth is, it's a whole lot harder to do that than we want to admit to ourselves. And even when you have the very best interviewing processes, you're not going to get it right 100% of the time. You're still going to get it wrong. And that's when you have to make sure that your ego doesn't get in the way. So with talking about interviewing and how this process works, I shared some of those questions with you. And what I like to do with this process, I found something called top grading. And I found it because a mentor was listening to me with some of my frustrations. And she said to me, have you ever read Who? And that book is down here on the floor as well if you'd like to look at it later. I said no. And she said, well, a lot of large companies use this process for interviewing and finding candidates. And I know you read, go read it, tell me what you think of it. And so I did. And I had some interviews that were pending for that Monday. I tend to listen to most of my books audio first, and then I actually will get a book later on. So a lot of times this looks like Saturday morning, I'm doing laundry, I'm cleaning the house, I'm listening to an audiobook, and I listen to things at about 1.5 speed so that I can get through them more rapidly. So I start listening to this, and all of the questions and experiences that I'd been having started to get answered. And I got so inspired that I stopped what I was doing and I reached out to the 5 pending candidates that I had and I said, can I do a phone interview tonight? And because it was Saturday, of course, no one's working, 3 of them agreed to phone interviews that evening. I continued to listen pretty much the rest of the day, finished the entire book in one day, the first time through, and proceeded to take what I had learned into a first phone interview. And the difference was so incredibly shocking to me that since then I've never gone back. And that basically is this chronological process of the first phone interview is you simply talk with the individual about their 2 most recent jobs. But as you open up the interview, you do something that's called torque. And it is like a truth serum. What that is it's the threat of a reference check. But it's not threat because you're going to actually make good on it. So you open up your interview, you say, hello, thank you so much for your interest in whatever your position is with the company you're in. This is how this interview is going to go today. We're going to spend about 30 minutes. I'm going to ask you 5 basic questions, the ones I just told you about. what was your position, who was your team, some things you're proud of, some challenges, your manager, overall rating, and what had you moving on. And just to let you know, before we make an offer to a candidate, we'll ask you to connect us with some of your previous managers. Is that all right with you? Now, here's what happens. This person hasn't had an interview with you yet. And you just said to them, I'd like to speak with one of your managers before you'd even have the possibility of a job offer. Is that okay? If I say to you, no, that's not okay, I'm going to look like I'm hiding something. So I'm going to say, of course. And it's going to sit in the back of my mind the whole time I'm talking to you. Because if you talk to that manager and that manager tells you something entirely different than what I'm telling you, then I'm in trouble. And so, truth serum. You get a lot more integrity. Not 100%, but it gets a whole lot closer. So you do your first couple-minute interview, and really 80% of the people are going to say yes to that, and they're going to move forward with the interview. There is a 20% who isn't. I have been on the phone, and I have had people say to me, are you kidding? There's no way I'm going to do that. I'm not even interested in this conversation. And I say, thank you. Neither of our time was wasted. If you don't want me to talk to a manager, I probably don't want to talk to you. And that was the end of that phone call. It lasted 3 minutes, and I got to go on and do a bunch of other valuable things for the day. All right. Before I go in deeper with how we walk through a resume, I'm going to actually go back just a little bit, and I want to talk with you a little bit about competencies, because this is a really important part of the next step of the interview process. Because we make a big deal in our company about making sure that we agree on what we need for a position, we actually wanted to get it down to something that's scorable. And so this is complete credits to top grading. This format comes from the index of that book. And the first thing your eyes are going to be drawn to is that some of these are color-coded. You have red, yellow, and green, and those do have meaning. Your red competencies are things that are very, very hard to train. They're pretty much, that's the way the person is. People change, but not much. That's very much what you're seeing there. Green competencies, those have a lot of leeway for training. Obviously, the stronger your candidate is, the better they're going to perform, the less support and training they're going to need, and we all want that. But if you can fudge a little bit more on those and say, we can work on that. And then yellow are sort of that straddling in the middle. And you want to be careful with how many of those you have. The next column I want to draw your eyes to is the one with the numbering system. It says MAR at the top, and that is minimum acceptable rating. This is done on a scale of 1 to 5. And this specific competency card, which there's one more here as well, was created for a bookkeeping position that we were interviewing for. And each job is going to look a little bit different. You're going to sit down and you're going to talk about, with a couple other key individuals, what you need in this position and agree upon what's acceptable. You're not going to get a 5 in every category. That's not realistic. I'm not a 5. You're not a 5 in every category. We have our strengths and we have our weaknesses, but what do we really need and what is the minimum that we're going to accept? And after we've done that, this goes to the second interviewer. The person who's functioning as the second interviewer, their 100% job is to sit there and take notes. And they listen as the main interviewer walks through all of their job history, and they rate that candidate against these competencies. Once you've finished your hour-long interview, you should have a scoring for each of these areas. And you should have some type of quantifiable number that lets you know how close that this person actually is to being a really good candidate. It's really hard to do that while maintaining a conversation. And that's why that second individual is incredibly important. So I want to give you some other little tips about how this works, but before I do, I'm going to go back a slide here, let you look at this one a little bit more. I'm going to tell you a story. When we start interviewing, it's not just job histories. I actually like to go back and start in high school, and this does come from Top Grading Foolproof Hirings down here on the table if you'd like to see it. And the reason we go back to high school is because what that does for an individual is it releases the stress of the moment. You might not want to talk to me about the job you're in right now that you might not be happy with. There might be conflict with a coworker or a manager. But if I say to you, so tell me about something that was influential in your life in high school, what does that have to do with today? Not much, right? You're good. It's relaxing. It can't possibly have that much impact. And the interesting thing is I was doing some hiring for one of our manufacturers for a sales position. And I had the owner sitting in my kitchen, and this conversation actually came up, and he said to me, well, you know, that's not really applicable to us. Some of us don't go through high school. I said, no, it's more about the age than it is about school. And I said, so tell me a story from the time frame between when you were 14 to 18. And so each of you just take a moment and think for yourself, think back to that time period of your life. And either an individual or a situation that made a big impact on where you were going to be later on in life. Now that you have your story in your mind, I said, so go ahead, tell me something. And he began to tell me a story from that period of his life. And this is where you use the questions. These are the questions that actually build out your story. I said, what was that like? Tell me, what did a day look like? What else? Tell me more. It wasn't very long into this conversation that he turned and he looked at me and said, I see what you're doing. I said, no, finish the story. And he did finish the story, and as he finished the story, I moved smoothly into the next step and said, so what was your first job? What did that look like? And he began to tell me, again, a little bit more about what that was. Here's a few more questions to look at. So what specifically were you responsible for? What was your area? What role did you play on that? Was that your idea? We didn't continue to move through his job history because I wasn't interviewing him, but we both saw exactly what happens. And that sets you up for a relaxed atmosphere, the ability for the person to actually walk you through. And many, many times as I start doing this, I discover all kinds of jobs that aren't on that resume that I had gotten. They weren't reported because we're walking, and so where did you go next? Well, then I actually just took this position. It's not on my resume, but, and they'll tell you some more. Well, what happened in that position? And you learn a really key part. When you're walking through this way, you start to see things that are repeating, and that's the most important part that you're looking for. You're wanting to look for characterization. It's absolutely okay if somebody worked for a company and it didn't go well at that company. But if somebody worked for 7 companies and all of their managers are horrible, just know you're going to be a horrible manager too. If every team that they've ever played on has always been rated a C team, they're going to rate your team as a C team too. If they typically have a positive outlook, and when you ask them about the team they're playing with, they tell you the names of people freely and say good things about people, you can be pretty sure that that's going to follow along with them. So you start to get this sense of who this individual is through each of their jobs. You build a picture. The questions that you're asking them, and in case you didn't get the first ones, those work into that whole conversation of the STAR questions before, where you're asking, what was that like? So tell me about this situation. What did you do? And what was the result? You get all of those pieces, but you get them in context. And so if that person had told you a story of how they took over someone else's department and made it a great success, if they have now told you the story in chronological order and you heard what they did to that person that set them up, you might see that entirely differently. Recently, I did an interview for a candidate, And I really liked the candidate. Sometimes you do an interview and you just resonate with the person. And there were a couple yellow flags throughout the interview, but I liked her. If I had been hiring on gut, I would have made a job offer right there. But I was following process. And so I asked for the references. And remember, these are references that you decide you want after you've talked through this person's job history. This isn't the 3 references that a lot of people have where it's, your grandmother and your best friend and some coworker, and they're all going to say nice, glowing, wonderful things about you because they want you to have this job. These are key people that you've talked already about with this individual that might be able to give you insight into what they're going to look like working for you. And when I started to do these reference checks, it didn't work out the way I thought it was going to. We started having a really hard time. None of the managers wanted to talk to me. And she would volunteer other people, friends that also knew during that time. And here's the interesting thing. You're going to find occasionally that someone won't talk to you. And the excuse that they're going to use is this one. I'm sorry, our company doesn't provide professional references. We can connect you with HR and they can confirm the dates the person worked here, but that's the best that we can do. That is a yellow flag. You may occasionally get that and it not be because they just had a bad experience, but 9 times out of 10, if this person is an A player and they're good, nobody minds saying good things about people. So if you call somebody, and we always ask them to ask for a personal reference, not a professional reference. So there is a difference there. We'd like you to function as a personal reference. And the individual is the one who sets those calls up. So you're not calling somebody blind. You're asking that candidate to go to the manager that they've already told you about and set up their personal reference and to let you know if they're willing to talk. And so they'll call you back and they'll say, yes, my manager, Tony Smith, is willing to talk Tuesdays afternoons, the best time for him. Here's his number. You're set. All the legwork is done. He knows you're going to be calling him. If nobody wants to talk with you, there's probably a reason. If the candidate doesn't want you to talk to people, there's probably a reason. And pay attention to that. So back to my story of the girl that I was really impressed with. None of her references checked out. All the ones I wanted to talk to, I couldn't talk to. All the others could only tell me good things, glowing stories about this person being the most wonderful, wouldn't give me a single negative, a single area of growth, and I ended up walking away. It makes me a little bit sad, but I know that there's a reason. Something isn't right, and better safe than sorry. How does this feel for an interviewee? Before we go on, I do want to talk about that just a little bit. There is definitely this concern that doesn't this feel really invasive to ask this many questions? Interestingly enough, what I have found happening is that people who we hire come to me later, often 3 and 6 months later, and they say, hey, can we talk about the hiring process? Yeah. That was the most scary experience I ever had, but it was actually what made me want to work for your company because I felt like you really cared about the team members that you were bringing on board. Recently, Dwayne mentioned this in his talk, we ended up hiring to replace for our dispatch position. And about 4 months after this individual had been on board, one of his previous employers reached out to him to try to get him back in their company. It would have been a job position, like 3 positions before ours. And he told me about it and turned them down. But he came to me and he said, I had another call with this guy, and can we talk? And of course, my immediate thought was, oh, he's going to come in, probably try to negotiate for more pay. Maybe he's going to want to take this job. We're now just at this really good place. But I said, yeah, of course we can talk. And he came in and he sat down. And he said, so I recently had a job offer, and he actually called me again yesterday. I turned him down both times, don't worry. But he said, it made me really reflect on the whole hiring process. And I don't think I ever told you this, but the reason that I left my successful job where I was was because walking through that interview process was very different from any other interview that I've ever had before. And it made me want to work in your company because I felt like you really cared about the people in your company. You listened to my entire story and you asked really good questions. And he said, whatever you do, do not change your hiring process. That's amazing. So it doesn't feel like an interrogation to people who don't have things to hide. To individuals who do have things to hide, it is going to feel really uncomfortable. But I think you'd rather find that out and have an uncomfortable interview than down the road. I did have a guy, a sales rep, as we started this interview process, get really upset and yell at me on the phone one day. And he said, I don't know who you think you are, but you're interviewing, like this is some 6-figure position, and I don't have any time for it. I said, thank you. I said, I'm sorry, this doesn't seem like it's a good fit. I do want you to know that this is a sales position, and we actually do believe it has the potential for 6 figures, not in the first, month or year, maybe, but it's an uncapped position, and we do take these positions seriously. He said, well, I'm just frankly not interested. I said, all right. And that was the end of the interview. So not everyone responds to it positively. All right, so as you do reference checks, here's a couple of things that I do with a reference check. After we've walked through our whole interview process, we've scored the candidate, we've sat together as a leadership team and talked about the options that we have in front of us, is making the reference check. So these are where you reach back out to the candidate and say, thank you so much for your interview with us. We really appreciated our time with you. We would like to move to the next step. For our company, the next step is that we would need you to connect us with some direct reports that you had before. And as we talk through this, we'd really love to talk to, John Doe from H&R Roofing. We'd also really like to speak with, whatever, Jordan, I can't think of any name off the top of my head, from your sales position here, and we'd also want to speak with, the third one, maybe 3 or 4 at least. Could you reach out to them, see if they'd be willing to function as a personal reference for you, and just let me know what time would be a good time for them. They'll call me back usually within hours and have all of them ready to go. In a few cases, I've had situations where an individual I really wanted to talk to had passed away, and in those cases, the individual usually is very willing to make another suggestion for someone that might also serve in some equal type of capacity, or we might move to another job position. I will try to pick jobs that I expect are going to be positive and ones that are negative that as we walk through the interview process. I ask the candidate to tell me on a scale of 1 to 10 how that manager is going to rate them. How do they think it's going to be? And if they tell me, well, probably a 7 to 8, why is that? And then they kind of unpack that a little bit more. Maybe it was a mismatch of personalities, whatever it was. Maybe there was a specific situation. Maybe they actually lost their job because of something that had happened, whatever that was. I like to try to get both. And I just realized that I'm probably not going to get through this whole talk, so I do apologize. The biggest thing in reference checks that has brought the most meaningful information to me as a manager of the people is the last and final question. You want to go through all of the first ones, but when you get to the end and you've really established this rapport with this direct manager and you ask the question, how could I lead this person better? That's where you want to take out your pen and start writing, because individuals will tell you really, really helpful things about what it looks like to lead and manage that individual, what their strengths were, what their weaknesses were, whether they maybe lacked some self-confidence or maybe they come off really aggressive out the front, but they've got a teddy bear heart. Whatever it is, they're going to help you understand that person in ways that you haven't uncovered in an interview. I'd like to talk just for a moment or two, and we're going to kind of collapse the last part of this to make sure that we get through this, about onboarding for success. One of the challenges that I've experienced with this is, first of all, building it for our own company, but then with doing some hiring for other companies, that handoff process has not always been easy. Making sure that if you have a really in-depth interview process, that when you go to onboarding, things don't just kind of fall off the cliff, that you actually set the person up for success, that you walk through the things that will make them be able to navigate those first couple weeks. I think it's pretty important that you realize that your first day on the job, and those first 2 days, you only have one chance to give that first impression. And you want to take all of those things that you've spent time putting together, those job descriptions, those scorecards, and at this point, the person should be privy to them. You want to sit down and share, this is actually how we interviewed you, and we believe you have these skills, but these are things that are ongoingly important to our company and that we're going to be talking about on a regular basis. Make sure they understand how they fit into the bigger picture of your organization. Share your organization's org chart. Share about the team dynamics and things they might expect, and do communicate working hours. I know that that sounds pretty basic, but I discovered that it is not something that people understand. And maybe that's just me because I was 22 before I knew that you could show up to something late, so that might be part of my problem. But I always assumed that if you said that someone starts at 9 o'clock, that they would be working in their seat at 9 o'clock. And so I was really shocked when people came flying in the door at 9 o'clock and then went to the break room and put up their lunch and made a cup of coffee and stopped to talk to Tony and never started working until 20 after 9. That, I didn't know you could do that. So if you ever experience that, it's really, really helpful just to make that really clear to your employees from the first day what your expectations are. And maybe you're fine with that. We actually have come to the place that we're fine with our people doing that, but they need to get there at 8:45 and be working at 9. So we want to encourage that team atmosphere. We want you to get your coffee and talk to your teammates, but we also need you in this position at this time. So make sure you clarify that. Make sure there's a mentor. Make sure that there's somebody in the company that's going to take them out for a meal sometime in the first week. I recommend that you be very careful about guy-girl combinations and that you make sure that's all above board. Again, these are things that you would think you don't have to clarify, but apparently you do. And train the rest of your team to really help with that onboarding process so that they're a part of welcoming that new team member on, maybe just in small ways. But if each person has a little task, you really get this sense of welcome. Make sure that the boss introduces them, gives them that value, and of course that you're sharing products, that your company, your products and services, even if that individual isn't actively involved in the products and services, they might have some type of more back office type of position, but they need to understand the greater portion of the picture and how they fit into that portion. I'm only going to have a couple of moments here to finish this up here, and I need to talk a little bit about letting people go and what it looks like when you've come to the end of the road and you know that you need to let people go. The first thing that I want to talk about here is that Dwayne and I have made a commitment to pray people into our company and to pray them back out. And I think that if you're a Christian, if you're a person of faith, that should resonate with you as well. That it's incredibly important that we realize that all of the relationships that we have, we're in partnership with God, with the Holy Spirit, and that we handle those with care. But just like anything else in life, even though we know that God provides our food, that doesn't mean that we don't work for it. And you can't just let God do all of that. So you can't just sit there and hope that it's going to all be taken care of for you. There's also some things that you need to do. And the first thing is just that communication piece. Dwayne touched on this with the one-on-ones, with the gap between what you're experiencing and what your expectations are, and the need to have those conversations to narrow it down. But there are times that that doesn't work, and that you do realize that it's the end of the road. Not every time. And I want to encourage you that many times you may think that if you bring this conversation to this point, this is the end. And you have to be prepared for it to be, but it isn't always. I want to tell you a story, and we're going to call him Kurt, of a guy that was with our company. And he was brilliant and incredibly good at his job, but he had some health conditions. And these health conditions made it very challenging for him to work in the morning. Now, when I say challenging, I'm talking about muscle spasms. That doesn't sound too bad, but listening to somebody throw up next to your desk, that's just not a great way to start the morning. And these physical issues that he had were actually impacting the rest of the team. And so I thought, this is a great opportunity to, be progressive, right? And do a remote work, offer in the morning to work remotely on things you could work remotely on, and the afternoon to work in the office on things that needed to be more in-house. And we began that process. It didn't take very long for me to realize that something wasn't the same. Not only were we not seeing the same type of work or the extent of work when he was at home, but in the office, things had started to change. He was jumpy, he was grumpy, he seemed like he hated his job. I was still early enough in the phase of this that I really, really wanted to have enough documentation to, without a shadow of a doubt, prove before I went and called him on it. And so I proceeded to compile documentation. I think I was just procrastinating. I knew what needed to be done, but it's hard to do these things. It's not fun. And I waited for an entire quarter. That's way too long. Don't ever wait that long before I finally called him in. And I had my documentation. I expected a fight. I expected pushback. And I said, hey, Kurt, we're here today to talk about the issue that we've talked about before, and here's the documentation. And he said, you're right. It's not a good fit for me to be doing that at home. I said, well, here's the 6-week plan. Here's the corrective measures. If we can walk through this and we can turn this around, we do really appreciate what you bring to the company. He said, absolutely. I'm here for it, 100%. He was very humble. He was very honest. He absolutely admitted to everything that I laid out. And we proceeded to walk through the next 6 weeks, meeting every week, talking about where it was. And of course, he did lose his privilege to work remotely. And he's still with the company 2 years later, and he's doing great. The interesting thing that happened in those couple weeks is that he changed, and he started enjoying his job again. He wasn't grumpy. He wasn't jumpy. I think it was a guilty conscience. It was weighing on him, and it made him miserable. And so just know that sometimes you've got to bring that a lot sooner than you think you do, and even if you think it's going to be the end of the road, it isn't always, and that's encouraging. If it is the end of the road, I'm not an expert on your state. I'm not even really an expert on my own state, but I have found Rocket Lawyer to be incredibly helpful to me to help me know what I need to be aware of in each of the states that we work in and the different documentation that's needed. The next thing is making sure that you have a company handbook. If you don't have a company handbook, I'd be happy to share with you a company handbook template that we built our company handbook off of. It really covers all of the areas that small businesses typically run into and need to have addressed. And you can take what fits for you and leave the rest. The reason that's important is that if you leave someone go, if you fire someone, you do open yourself up to the possibility of a lawsuit, to the possibility of the individual saying that it was unfair termination or that it wasn't rightful termination. And so if you've clearly outlined what your expectations are of behavior in your handbook, you can point to your handbook. You have the employees review it, they sign off on it, and the benefit of using a handbook template is that you didn't create it. When we brought a handbook template into our company, one of our long-term employees came to me and said, I feel like you've unfairly targeted individuals in the company when you wrote this handbook. And I was able to say, I didn't. Would you like to see the template that we pulled it off from? And I literally provided the template to that individual and showed them that it was word for word from small business. And that meant that a lot of other small businesses were experiencing the very same issues that we were experiencing. Did it target that individual incidentally? Yes, but it didn't intentionally. And that's really helpful in that you're not, nobody feels as much targeted that way. So you can actually talk about it. Hey, we're doing this. I know it's new. This is not specific to anyone. If you feel like you see reflections that might be we welcome to see where it came from. And that was really helpful. Typically speaking, rule of thumb is you need to have 3 documents before you fire. So there needs to be a verbal notice. There needs to be 1 and 2 written notices. And you can fire somebody without doing that, but you do risk 2 things. One is them filing for unemployment and winning. I have walked through several unemployment filings. I have won most of them. I have also expended a lot more time and energy than I ever should have. You do need to get past yourself. You do need to be able to let go of your ego. For me, if I had to fire somebody for not doing their job, I don't really want to keep paying them after they walk out the door. That kind of just burns me up. But at the end of the day, what you end up paying in unemployment might actually be less than if you get tangled in a lengthy battle that takes several months. Unfortunately speaking from personal experience there. So make sure your documentation is in order. Usually you will win that case easily. You won't even have to go to court. You'll literally be able to answer a questionnaire, cite your handbook, what was broken in that handbook, provide a copy of that handbook. They're going to review that and agree in your favor. That's typically what I've experienced. But be really careful about talking to other employees about why you had to let someone go. This is really hard because most of the time, you're privy to a piece of information that if everybody knew, would make you look a lot better. And it's really, really hard not to share that. And really hard to let people on your team assume things that are totally false and not speak. But if you do, just know that you do open yourself to the potential of a lawsuit and that someone can come back and sue you for libel, for defamation, and for saying things about them. So the best thing you can do is not talk about it. Don't share any details at all. That's a quick overview of some of those areas. I meant to have that up while I was talking about it, but make sure you're treating each individual fairly. You don't want someone to come after you because of some type of preferential treatment. You want to make sure that what you're sharing is what you're doing, the actions you took for one individual, you would take for all of your individuals. The documentation, the confidentiality. Do know that there is some laws for severance and benefits. If you have someone on salary for any length of time, specifically salary or longer tenure, you may be required by state to pay them severance. Make sure you know your state law. Again, Rocket Lawyer is a good resource for that. And make sure you take time to communicate with the person. If you've sat and talked first and you've walked through these things, it's not a surprise. There has not been a single case of any firing that I've ever done that the person was actually surprised that it happened. So make sure that you talk about those things early and that you listen to what they have to say as well. It will make the process much, much smoother and maintain all of those documents. Make sure you have them ready to go. And here's where I need to wrap up because our time is at an end and we've only come to my most favorite portions. But I'm going to go through them just really quickly and give you just a little bit of a chance to. It's not just about hiring, it's not just about firing. It really is about building your team. I think Dwayne shared a lot of things this morning that are really helpful for that. But keep in mind that atmosphere, autonomy, and accountability are incredible factors for continuing to grow your team. And make sure that you deal with your things. You show up and you bring those things with you, and it absolutely impacts everybody underneath you. So you have to learn how to get out of your own head and deal with your own issues quickly. You're the atmosphere. Most of the times we don't think about atmosphere. The only time I hear anyone talking about atmosphere is when it is cloudy, smoky, when something is bad. And a lot of times that's what good leadership is like. When you hear people talking about leadership, they're usually talking about negative things. So be aware of that. Make sure that you're dealing with your things, that you're showing up for your people, and that you're appreciating what they're doing, that you're pointing out the good. Catch people doing things that are right and call them out. It might have been an accident, it might have been unintentional, but when you recognize even those unintentional good things, they become intentional tomorrow. Give people autonomy, work through your decision process, make sure people know what they're allowed to decide on and what they're not allowed to decide on. Give them as much freedom within your structure as you possibly can, And when things go wrong, because they will, be solutions-oriented, not blame-oriented. Everything is figure-outable. And as you walk through what happened, you will discover who was at it. And yes, there are things that you're going to need to talk about. There are going to be notes that you'll take into your one-on-one meetings. But in the moment, what you want to do is talk about what happened and how do we fix it. Not who did it, not blame. You want people to be able to feel confident to come forward with solutions, to be part of solving those things and not worry that they're going to get in trouble for it. Autonomy is really, really crucial, and balancing that with your clear expectations. Autonomy is not abdication. I see a lot of people confusing this in their mind. They think that if they abdicate and just step back and give everything to the other individual, that that's what that looks like, and it's not. Early on, I did this approach much more as equals, and I treated people the way I wanted to be treated. Golden rule, right? You treat people the way you want to be treated. Unfortunately, through a lot of hard knocks, I realized that 80% of the people on my team want more structure and more guidelines than I would be comfortable with. And by doing that, I actually bring peace to them. And I bring sort of a foundation or the ability for them to function well. And so I had to learn what people needed, not just doing what I would want. It ended up giving them too much freedom, ended up leaving them feeling adrift, not empowered. That sense of ownership can really boost the commitment to your team's success and your company's goals. And finally, accountability. This is really, Dwayne talked about this, that each person is accountable for themselves. But this is where your job descriptions, your scorecards, and your one-on-one meetings come together. This is that chance to actually continue that conversation, to create that healthy environment. And this is where oftentimes we jump in to solve problems where we shouldn't, where we need to step back and we need to allow the individual to come up with a solution themselves. And that builds the autonomy as well. One of the ways that I like to do this with our team is to say, what do you think we should do about it? And then to listen. And even if you find something that is totally not correct, and that's not how it needs to be done, be really careful with how you actually address that. One of the illustrations that happened just a couple weeks ago is we had a financial issue, and one of the individuals came to me and they said, this is what's happening. And I did, what do you think we should do? And they told me very clearly they had a very good plan with what they needed to do. But the delivery was very, very poor. And so I said, you're right on. You see exactly what needs to happen. Give me 3 ways that we could share this that would be a little bit more palatable. How do you think we could say the same thing and it would be easier to hear? It didn't take, excuse me, it didn't take very long for them to reflect and come up with a much better delivery. And that's all that was needed. Just a little bit of coaching. Not my words on delivery, but a little bit of reflection. And that brings us here to the end of our talk. I'd just like to challenge you to take one of these areas for Q4. Which one of these things resonated with you? Was it the fact that you need to get some job descriptions and some competencies in place? Maybe it's that you need to change your interviewing process, or that you have that down but your onboarding process isn't so great. Whatever it is, go ahead and notate on your piece of paper what it's going to look like when that issue changes and who you're going to tell about it. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I wish you all success in your journey with people and welcome any further conversations that you might want to have. Thank you.